Hello, everyone. Um, my name is Julie Shinn, and I'm a board member of the Stanford Nurse Alumni, and together with the Stanford Medical School alumni, we're happy to bring you this webinar today entitled Climate Change: Impact on Global Health. I'd like to say a special thank you too to Anthony Lee, who's the program manager of the Stanford Medical School Alumni Relations, and he has provided all the technical support and background for this program. Thank you all for attending. I think when you talk to the average person on the street and about climate change, they will tell you that or describe it as the need to cut fossil fuel, to get electric cars, to change the heating system. They might mention the plight of the polar bears, loss of habitat, and violent storms, but there's a lot more to it than that, and a lot more. Is having a lot more impact. And as healthcare professionals, we have a special interest in the impact on health, especially for vulnerable populations. And we've put this webinar together with that in mind, taking a look at some different aspects of climate change that will potentially impact health on a global scale, and in particular, our most vulnerable populations. One note, please submit your questions as we progress through the webinar. The questions will be handled by the panelist speakers at the conclusion of our last speaker. So I hope you enjoy the program. I'd like to start out by introducing you to Dr. Lyndsey Darrow, who is a professor in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics and Environmental Health in the School of Public Health at the University of Nevada, Reno. So welcome, Lyndsey.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you to the Stanford Nurse Alumni for organizing this panel. It's always great to have a chance to connect back to the farm. I am going to kick off the presentations today by talking about acute health effects of extreme heat. And by acute, what I mean is health effects that happen fairly quickly in response to heat exposure. So really on a matter of days scale. And given the limited time, I'm going to focus on two outcomes, mortality and preterm birth. If you only have two, birth and death are pretty good indicators to start with. All right, so many of you have likely seen this chart or something like it, showing how global temperatures have been steadily increasing over time. So what this is showing is how much hotter or colder summer global temperatures are each year relative to a reference set of decades, which here is the 1950s to the 1970s. And what you can see is in 2023, we broke the record by quite a large margin. And last week, which was probably buried in other news cycles of last week, but we did learn last week that 2024 will again be a record-breaking year. And unfortunately, it may be the first to surpass this 1.5 degrees Celsius warming threshold that was set out in the Paris Climate Accord. And as expected, as those average temperatures are going up, we're seeing a corresponding increase in heat waves. So these graphs are from the EPA, and they're based on data from cities across the US. And they show that heat waves are occurring more often than they used to across the United States. And then when they do occur, they're tending to be longer and hotter than in past decades. And also, one of the more dramatic charts on this slide is in the lower left-hand corner. And you can see the length of the warm season when these heat waves are occurring has really been expanding. Heat waves are happening outside of peak summer months, unlike they used to. And those of you in the Bay Area right now recently experienced a big heat wave in October. So you have firsthand knowledge of this trend going on. I'll note that there is no gold standard definition of a heat wave, which actually makes synthesis across some health studies somewhat challenging. Here, the EPA is defining them as a 2 or more day period of locally hot temperatures, so relative to the local norms. And specifically, they use an 85th percentile of temperature for that threshold. But if you used other definitions, like some absolute temperature threshold, like 90 degrees or something like that, you would see these same trends happening across time that correspond to generally increasing temperatures. So one example of an extreme heat wave was the 1995 Chicago heat wave in July of that year. And it wasn't just high temperatures, it was very humid air mass that sat over Chicago, and with the worst of it really happening on July 13th and 14th. So very high heat index. And what you see in this graph is you see the green line, which shows you the temperature, and this doesn't incorporate humidity, but you can see when the temperatures peaked around the 13th and 14th of July. You see the red line shows the number of deaths each day in 1995 by date. And the orange line is showing you the average daily deaths across a long time period. So for each of those calendar days, what's the average daily deaths? And I like this graph because it provides a sense of how we actually study these acute health responses. Here you can see a large spike in mortality, many times above what you would expect based on the long-term averages shown in that, represented by that orange line. And it's estimated that an excess number of deaths of about 700 occurred during this one extreme heat event, mostly among the elderly and in the poorest areas of Chicago. It's important to note here also that we would not, if we just looked at death certificates and the causes of death listed on those certificates, we would vastly underestimate the number of deaths that are happening in response to this heat wave. Even in this very obvious extreme event where people were aware of it, there were several hundred deaths that we believe are due to the heat wave that were not coded as at all related to heat. And when epidemiologists look at where the excess deaths are coming from, the biggest area, the biggest cause of death is actually cardiovascular disease. So heat stress is very hard on the cardiovascular system. You have, with dehydration, a loss of salts in water that affects blood parameters, so increase in blood clotting. There's a lot of taxing of the heart, getting blood to the skin to try to reduce body temperature. So you see a lot of cardiovascular events after these big heat events. You also see an excess of kidney disease deaths and respiratory failure. So kidney disease, usually among people who have chronic kidney disease, some other vulnerable condition. But there's also other subgroups of people who have other underlying health conditions that make them more vulnerable to these types of exposures. So some people have conditions or medications that they're taking that actually affect the nervous system's ability to regulate body temperature. So some of those may also be mixed in. So when you look at this example and similar evidence, I think it's pretty convincing as far as observational epidemiologic studies go, because the universe of alternative explanations for what is causing this huge spike in mortality are very limited. So essentially, we're comparing the population to itself. And the poverty level over a couple of days isn't changing. The proportion of smokers isn't changing. So there's a limited number of factors that are changing in this window. So we consider this to be a natural experiment and pretty strong causal evidence. And there are many other major heat waves showing the same pattern of increased mortality after these events. The 2022 heat waves in Europe killed about estimated 70,000 people. And those are based on similar methods and I believe to be pretty strong evidence. So that was just one event. But what about more globally? So this is a paper that was published in a pretty prominent journal, Nature Climate Change. And in 2021, they looked at 43 different countries. And what this is showing is using these methods, they're estimating what proportion of deaths in the summer are due to heat. So if you look at the whole bar in each of those locations, and you can see the percentage of deaths in the summer that are attributable to heat. But they also took it a step further, and they looked at, okay, we know that some heat waves would occur and some heat would occur even in the absence of human-induced climate change. So let's try to tease out what proportion of these deaths are actually due to human-induced climate change. What they did is they simulated weather patterns in the absence of greenhouse gas emissions, and then estimated the deaths with those under those weather conditions and compared them to what we've actually observed. And so what you see on this chart is the lighter color part of the bar chart is showing the proportion of deaths in the summer that would likely have occurred without any climate change. And the dark part of the bar chart is the proportion of the deaths that is attributable to human-induced climate change. And so what they found overall across all these locations is that on average, about 37% of all heat-related deaths appear to be due to human-caused global warming. And of course, this is only going to increase over time as the proportion of heat waves that occur are more and more due to this warming effect. So the Mortality Association has been pretty well known for a long time, although we're still learning more about it. But what about more subtle effects on other outcomes, for example, in pregnancy? And this is an area that I work a lot in. In the last 10 years or so, there have been a number of studies showing acute associations between extreme heat and miscarriage, stillbirth, shortened gestational age, premature rupture of the membranes, which is the water breaking during pregnancy. And all of these outcomes could plausibly be triggered by heat waves. When you think about dehydration and its effect on blood flow, diverting blood that would be going to the developing fetus to the extremities to try to decrease body temperature. We know that there's an inflammatory response during heat stress, and there's a number of inflammatory processes that could be triggers of labor. So there are certainly biological rationales for why this association might exist. And one of the set of outcomes that I'm particularly interested in is preterm birth and early term birth, preterm birth being less than 37 weeks, and early term birth being 37 to 38 weeks. And I'm interested in these outcomes because they're major causes of neonatal morbidity and mortality, and they affect lifelong health trajectories. So neurodevelopmental, respiratory, immune function, these events that happen really early in life actually can affect a person's long-term health trajectory. So earlier this year, my colleagues and I published this study that was funded by the National Institutes of Health. And what we did is we looked at birth records in the 50 most populous metropolitan statistical areas in the US over a 25-year period. And that included about half of all US births, so 53 million births. In fact, some of you listeners may actually be in this study if you gave birth in the warm season in one of these major cities in that time period. The circles on the map just show you the relative size of the population. And we didn't skimp on sample size here because we really wanted to look at extreme heat waves, which in any given location can be rare, at least historically. So we needed a lot of statistical power to estimate these associations. So our design is very conceptually similar to that Chicago heat wave slide I showed earlier. Basically, we identify which days are heat wave days in each location, and then we identify the counts of preterm birth and the counts of early term birth, and then also the pregnancies that are at risk on each of those days, because that pregnancy risk set is constantly changing. So our study question is, do rates of preterm and early term birth increase in the days following a heat wave? And here are a subset of results. So if you're interested, the paper is actually open access, but to give you a sense, we looked at several definitions of heat waves, and we specifically looked in the 4 days preceding birth. So on the left side of that graph are the definitions of the heat waves. We looked at in the 4 days preceding birth, were there 2 consecutive, 3 consecutive, 4 consecutive days of heat, with heat being defined as the 97.5th percentile of temperature. So we're looking at the hottest 2.5% of days, and then those days occurring together consecutively. And that last definition per degree Celsius is looking at, okay, if if the average of the last 4 days was over that 97.5 temperature threshold, how much over was it? So for every degree Celsius, what is the increase in risk? So what we're showing here is the rate ratio, essentially comparing the rate on those heat wave days or following heat waves to similar days that would not have been classified as a heat wave. Basically, what we see is a positive association with daily rates of preterm and early term birth, stronger associations with longer heat wave duration and higher temperatures. But the magnitude of increase in the rates is very subtle. It's very small, 1 to 2%. But of course, this is for the overall population. And we know the vast majority of people in the United States do have access to air conditioning. And so the fact that we see an overall population increase in the rates following these events suggests that there's a subpopulation of people that are perhaps that are experiencing exposure to these heat waves that are actually showing a bigger response. So when we look at the subpopulations of people and try to get a sense for who those populations might be that are vulnerable, of course, when you're doing a study of millions of people, you have limited data on the individuals. But we do have some socio-demographic information from the birth records. And what we see when we look at subgroups, we see, and this is the effect, what I'm showing you here is the effect for a 1 degree Celsius increase during those heat wave time periods. We see that racial and ethnic minority groups tend to have a little bit stronger of a signal of increased risk. We have younger women tend to show a bigger spike. Also, interestingly, older mothers, so over 35, for preterm birth specifically show an association. And I mention this because this is actually a finding that has been somewhat consistent across a number of studies. And we also see, there's a delay there. We also see a signal for lower educated groups tend to also show a overall stronger association between these early birth metrics and exposure to heat waves. And what we speculate is that these groups have a larger proportion of people that are socioeconomically disadvantaged. And so if you have a larger proportion of people actually maybe having less access to air conditioning or maybe not running their air conditioning at full capacity because of cost concerns, these subgroups might suggest a little bit more exposure to the heat. So just to give a sense more globally, in Europe, you also tend to see the same associations, except a little bit stronger. And that makes a lot of sense because air conditioning prevalence in Europe is much lower than the United States. Here are just some samples of accruing studies. These are from Italy, Spain, and Germany. But there's many other studies that have been emerging. And there's far less data available from low and middle income countries on this question, they experience the highest rates of preterm birth and the most extreme heat waves. So in many ways, these are locations where we're most concerned about the impact of these increasing temperatures. But of course, they often don't have available electronic medical records. And in particular for this study question, the methods of pregnancy dating, so identifying whether a baby's born preterm or not, those data often don't exist on a large scale. But this study was one of few that actually looked at this question in low and middle income countries. So they looked at 14 countries. And the way they looked at this was using existing survey data. So there was a small subset of people in each of these locations who had filled out a survey, and they analyzed those data. And what you see on the right-hand side is a plot I pulled from their paper that while somewhat underpowered, so we wish we had a larger sample size, you can still see a bit of a trend that there's an increasing risk with increasing temperature for heat and preterm birth. So to wrap up, one of the things that is evident in this world of acute health effects of heat and on mortality and preterm birth is that vulnerability to heat is likely based on both physiological factors, so life stage, age, underlying health conditions, but also whether or not a person is actually being exposed to the heat. And a lot of times that relates to socioeconomic conditions. And so there's a component here of adaptability, that there's a potential to improve outcomes here as we identify high-risk populations and maybe the biological mechanisms leading to these outcomes. That can lead to opportunities for targeted prevention, like in a clinical setting or public health awareness. There's also been this advent of cooling centers, urban planning that reduces urban heat islands, and also awareness campaigns. But of course, all this requires resources. And so a lot of this is a lot more challenging in low resource settings that could potentially be most affected by this. And then the last thing I'll end with is just that until about 10 years ago, the potential for high temperatures to actually affect pregnancy, I would say, was not really on anyone's radar, to say nothing of medium and longer term health implications of these exposures, which frankly are largely unexplored to this point. They fit less neatly into the natural experiment framework I just showed you today. But there are many health outcomes that we might not be expected to be related to climate in any way that will turn out in very subtle ways to be affected by these climate-related exposures. So I would say we're really only at the beginning of understanding the true impact of climate change on health. And with all of many subtle changes across many outcomes, the end result could be extremely broad impacts for human health. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Darrow. I was flustered when we were beginning because we were starting a little late, and I failed to mention that Dr. Darrow is also an alumni of Stanford, received her undergraduate education here. So we all have a thread or an affiliation with Stanford. Our next speaker is Dr. Jane Willenbring, and she's going to speak on climate change threats to soil sustainability and crop success. She comes to us from the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences, where she's an associate professor. She's also on faculty with the Dorr School of Sustainability. So welcome, Dr. Willenbring.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And it's really a wonderful opportunity to get to talk to this group. I hope that I'm able to teach you some things about soil today. So some of the things are a little bit that I'm going to be talking about are a little bit less on the front of your mind. We're not talking about things that will kill you imminently, like we just heard in the last talk. And so I want to start off by thinking about soil in general. And let's see, it's taking a little bit of time. Okay, so this is, I probably think, oh shoot, there's such a delay. I probably think a little bit more about soil than the average person. So this is actually like the place that I grew up. I'm originally from North Dakota. We lived on a subsistence farm in a very rural area in North Dakota. And one of the things that was really very obvious to us, if you rely on the soil for food, is how important it is to your very survival. And I think that there's a lot of people in the United States and the world, especially in urban centers, where that's not necessarily the case. And so you probably go through years of your life without even thinking about soil necessarily. And in fact, one of the jokes is that if you tell people that you're a soil scientist on a plane or something like that, you'll hear people like mostly like nod and try to avoid the conversation. But then every now and then, people will mishear you and think that you said soul scientist, and they'll ask you about the paranormal activity that they're expecting you to measure or something like that. And so in those conversations, very clear that they think it's more likely that you're a scientist that studies souls than soil. So that's always very surprising to me. But one of the things that has come up in my life as I've become a scientist and have kind of reflected on the place that I'm from is that this is a beautiful kind of bucolic area. And some of the things that we do in my lab is to actually like not just think about soil, but actually answer this question of like, how many years can a mountain exist before it's washed to the sea? It seems like one of those questions that's sort of philosophical that you could never answer. At least that's how it's posed in this Dylan song, Blowing in the Wind. And so we actually, in my lab, like figure out how long it takes for a mountain to be washed into the sea. I know it seems really surprising and that it might not have any impact on your life. So let me bring up why you might care about how long it takes for particles of soil to move around on the soil surface, on the Earth's surface. So one of the fundamental questions that we have is, why does this landscape have soil? So you can see how there's all kinds of like places to grow crops, to have cattle, things like that, food production, for example. And then we go just a little bit west of where I'm from in North Dakota, and there's this badland landscape. So same kind of rocks, same vegetation for the most part, except you can see that some of it isn't covered in vegetation, and that's kind of the point, is why is there less soil in one place and more soil in another place? And so this is, it turns out, a fundamental question. And the reason that it's related to the topics around climate change and health are that if we look at these two places in North Dakota, here is one small star where we see those badland topography where we don't actually have any soil. And then over here is where we have soil. There's only, maybe a couple of inches of rain or precipitation difference between a ecosystem that can sustain soil and keep soil in because it can have vegetation on it, which kind of the roots hold in the soil when there's a rain event, or on the flip side, in the West, where we don't have enough precipitation to support the vegetation that is there, and we very quickly go into one of these kind of threshold states where we have no more soil left. And one of the things that we kind of think about in my group is maybe there are places in the United States where we actually have zombie soils, we can imagine, to borrow a phrase that another Stanford professor has used for forests, where like zombie forests, where the forests are kind of outside of the climate range that they can actually live in. And so they're kind of like dead men walking. And so this doesn't just happen in some of these natural experiments in the Midwest. This happens in all kinds of places. So this is in San Diego, where it's one little small valley. This is going down to Black's Beach, just north of La Jolla in north of San Diego. And so you can imagine that this is the north-facing slope. And when you stand and get in the morning, like maybe north-facing sunlight, you think, oh, this is so nice, I'm warm. This is the perfect time to have a sunbeam hit my face. But then if you're on the south-facing window in the afternoon, you think, oh my gosh, I need to get into the shade. This is too much for me. And so that same experience is what we see in ecosystems, where on the south-facing hill slope, you get that really intense south-facing sun, and you have extra water needs for the same vegetation, for the same rock type in order to maintain that soil. In places like Alaska, it actually goes differently so that we are maybe able to grow more soil if it's on the warm side of the slope compared to the cold side of the slope. Okay, so there are these places where we have no soil, and you might think, surely soil is such a fundamental thing. People must study it a ton. I can't believe that we wouldn't know what controls whether there's soil on slopes. And unfortunately, that is not true. And one of the reasons I think is that a lot of people think like kind of treat soil like dirt. And in fact, I had a friend who was, kind of one of those people who thinks about the social cost of carbon. So how much, like in terms of the harm that carbon does in the atmosphere, how much does that actually cost us as a society? And maybe we should charge for it. And so I was thinking like, oh, Kate, hey, we should get the cost of soil so that we can actually figure out like all the things that soil does. And if people didn't treat soil like dirt, how would we value it? Like, and what are all the things that would go into that calculation? And she said, I don't have to do that calculation. Look, here's the Home Depot ad, and here's how much soil is worth. And so this is one perspective on how much is soil worth. It's how much people will pay for it, right? Which is not much. It's $4.28 for a huge bag. And so if we step back, though, we consider all of the things that soil does for us in terms of ecosystem services. So most of, I would say 99% of the antibiotics that we use today originate in soil. Soil is responsible for all of the fresh water that we drink. All of that fresh water that is available for us to drink that doesn't have contaminants, heavy metals, things like that, is all filtered through a huge Brita filter that is the Earth's soil. Of course, we also rely on, with the exception of the ocean, soil for food. And I'll talk a little bit more about that too. So the presence of soil is really important. And in terms of what we are talking about when we talk about soil, one of the things that we talk about when a geologist is thinking about soil is that there's rock that soil is made from. Soil also encompasses the organic portion, so the carbon that's sequestered from trees or by trees and then falls onto the surface. But soil is really being produced from top down, like that addition of organic matter, but then also from the bottom up. And the top-down portions are really, really important. We hear a lot about carbon and how much carbon is stored in soils, but the amount of soil that is actually produced from the rock is also really important. We get all kinds of minerals that we need. We get all kinds of important nutrients that we need. And as soils sit around, I always think of it as sort of like a trail mix. So as soils sit around, all of the yummy, like peanuts and M&Ms and cashews get taken up by the organic material. Those are the really yummy nutrients. And then ultimately, we're just kind of left with some things that are not as plentiful in terms of primary nutrients. And so a lot of the things that we rely on for food, for example, have like, even if we're talking about not just the nitrogen that goes into the protein as part of our food, but also little tiny micronutrients that are incredibly important that we have that we never even think about, that is coming ultimately from soil. And I always think that this is one of the ways that soil wonderfully connects us. So if we think about like a banana that we had this morning, that banana is getting its potassium from the soil in Ecuador. And now it's causing my heart to beat at 100 beats per minute. Boom, 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 boom. And that is happening for you too. Where did you get your calcium that's allowing your heart to beat in lockstep? Okay, so we have this soil, and one of the real challenges for us is to understand, like, what are the conditions for even keeping soil on the landscape in the sense of a changing climate where we think that there are some of these thresholds that can be crossed where we're no longer able to hold soil on the landscape. And this really gets into like the question of soil sustainability. So in order for us to understand how to keep soil on the landscape, we have to know how much we're eroding of soil. And that's a whole different question where we can get into things like land use and farming practices and things like that. I'm going to take a step back and just think about like where soil ultimately comes from, how it's produced, especially this bottom-up portion. And so one of the things that we think about is that there's a rate of soil production. So how fast is soil being created on the hill slopes? And how does this relate to soil depth? And so one of the people who has worked on this in the past, distant past, is G.K. Gilbert, who said that there's some kind of mechanism by which soil production, or the rate at which it grows, is dependent on how much soil there is. And so he said, well, let's imagine that there's a lot of soil. Maybe the rate of soil production goes down as we have thicker and thicker soils. And then as we thin our soils, we create more soil. This makes sense for a couple of reasons, partly because most of the earth has soil. And so if you thin the soil, you maybe want to grow it in some way that balances that out. And then also we don't have infinitely thick soils. And so it kind of made sense in some ways. And so this was kind of the model for a long time. And then we created or are looking at different ways of looking at how soil moves around. And so one of the ways that we do that is we use little radioactive isotopes that are produced from bomb testing. This is an example where this guy, known only to history as Tommy, in 1955 is having a sandwich on top of a nuclear bomb. And that bomb caused all kinds of man-made isotopes that stick to soil, and we can use those in order to figure out where soil is moving on the landscape. So that's part of it. One of the tools that we use. Another one of the tools that we use, especially in my lab, is to try to understand how cosmic radiation is kind of giving the Earth sort of a star suntan. So we can use this in order to figure out how long soil exists on the hill slopes in some of these places, like both in the Midwest, where we rely on them for food, and then also kind of more natural places. And so one of the things that we have found when we did this is we were testing this model of how soil production rates scales with soil depth in this beautiful place in Puerto Rico, the Yunque Peak in the Luquillo Mountains. And this is my student, Emma Harrison. And what she found is that instead of relying on soil depth as a main factor, in this place where there's lots of water and it's teeming with life, we have a really high rate of soil production, regardless of what the soil depth is. And then when we go to other places, what we find is that if we have less water available, that we have less thick soils and less rapid rates of soil production. And so this gets to be really important, because what this says instead is that if the view before was that if we erode soils, they'll just grow faster, we found that that is not true. And in fact, that soil production rate is set by climate, and that we can't kind of escape sort of this kind of governor on how soil maintains on or is sustained on a landscape in on long time scales. And so I just want to kind of end there. This is something that is sort of a super important long-term thing that we think about, but then it's also something that we have to think about in terms of like growing food security, right? So plants have optimal ranges that they have evolved with people and civilization relying on them for food at these kind of optimal ranges, where above those particular temperatures of 35 degrees C, for example, for like wheat and rice and soybeans, that we actually can still maintain these food stocks. Corn is a little bit higher. And then as we go higher and higher in temperatures, we are losing some of the ability to even grow those crops. But more important is it's not even a bioengineering problem at that point, because we might not have even the soils to hold the dirt and the water and create all of these ecosystem services that we know that soil provides. So thank you so much, and I look forward to taking your questions in the Q&A period.
Thank you, Dr. Willenbring. That brings us to our next topic. We're going to go from soil to taking a look at the impact of that climate change has on infectious disease. So we're pleased today to have Dr. John Openshaw join us. He's with the Division of Infectious Diseases and Geographic Medicine in the Department of Medicine at Stanford School of Medicine. So welcome, Dr. Openshaw.
Thank you very much, Julie. And I'm going to try to give you a whirlwind tour of how climate change might affect pathogens and infectious diseases. I apologize because almost every slide in this brief introduction could be a lecture in and of itself. So I apologize for rushing. It's really useful to have a framework by which to start thinking about this. And this is going to be a gross oversimplification, but hopefully it'll give us some direction over the next 10 or 15 minutes. So as we have our climate changing and the resulting environmental change, those long list of changes puts pressure on four main things that I want to talk about. The first are going to be infectious disease vectors. These are things like mosquitoes and ticks, things that move an infection from one individual to the next. And you can have changes in vector survival or behavior, but you can also have changes in vector geography. Closely related to those vectors would be disease reservoirs. These are the natural host of an infectious pathogen. And again, those environmental change can lead to changes in a reservoir survival or changes in their behavior. And additionally, you can have changes in disease reservoir geography. Perhaps the most direct change you can have is the climate change actually affecting a pathogen itself, whether that be a pathogen's replication, its virulence, or its transmission ability. And finally, the fourth thing, we have to remember that half of the equation for any disease is the host which is being infected. So any change in human behavior can lead to change in dynamics. So all of these things taken together can change infectious disease dynamics and burden. And what I wanted to do is take this simple framework and just provide some vignettes for each of these examples and go through how changes in climate might be affecting the pathogen and might be affecting the disease burden. So I wanted to start looking at a disease vector and reservoirs with a real stress on the vectors, because I think the sort of classic example of this are mosquito-borne infectious diseases. And we all know mosquitoes. We all know mosquitoes as vectors. It's hard to appreciate the true diversity of mosquitoes. There are a lot of them, and they all differ in their behavior, who they like to bite, when they come out, where they like to hide. Here are just four examples, but I only want to show this to say that what I'm showing you is a simplification, which could be greatly complicated by the fact that there are lots of different mosquito species, and they're all slightly different. Additionally, there are a lot of diseases that are borne by mosquitoes. And this slide just has a the tip of the iceberg of these, with a strong bias towards viruses, which are sort of my favorites. But these range from dengue to Zika to West Nile and malaria. And there's just a ton of these. And again, each of these is going to be slightly different. So again, take these next slides as sort of a simplified way that you can think about mosquitoes and climate. Now, the one thing that I don't think that will come as a huge surprise is it's really hard to be a mosquito. Not only is everyone trying to slap you out of the air and kill you, and you can't fly that quickly, but you're also cold-blooded. And that means that you're very sensitive to temperature, precipitation, and humidity. Well, how sensitive? It helps to think about the mosquito life cycle, which I'm showing you here from the eggs to the larva to the adult, and then you have host-seeking behavior where you seek out a human or another animal and you bite that individual, you take a blood meal, and you're back at the egg stage. So most, if not all of these, have some climatic factor involved. Let's just start at this very important developmental stage, moving from the eggs to the larva stage to the adult. In general, increasing temperature leads to decreasing developmental time. And just to show some raw data that shows this, so here you have two of the stages, hatch to emergence in the larval stage, with the development time and the temperature. And you can see overwhelmingly, as you increase the temperature, the time to development goes down for both of these. Now, it's not just the development, it's also the survival of the adult mosquito. And in general, temperature determines survival duration. And here again is some experimental data for two Aedes species. And I'm going to just show an arrow here where you can see that the longest lifespan is about that temperature. And as you get too warm and as you get too cold, the overall survival duration decreases. It's also happened, temperature also happens to affect host seeking in two real ways. One is that the temperature determines the wing beat frequency, which really is the insect's ability to fly. Additionally, temperature is a may determinant of the distance the insect can actually fly. So you can see improved host-seeking behaviors at certain temperatures. And just to complete out the circle, in addition, the frequency and the biting rate is also determined by temperature. So if we move to the bigger picture here, and that is, so this is sort of a schematic showing, what transmission of a disease like dengue or malaria might look like. You start out with an uninfected mosquito. That mosquito bites an infected person. Therefore, that mosquito becomes infected. And then that infected mosquito goes on to bite a non-infected human, leading to a new human case. Now, the incubation period, or the amount of time that that pathogen requires to mature within that mosquito, is incredibly important. And it might not surprise you that that period is also exquisitely dependent on temperature. And here are just two examples, malaria on the top and dengue on the bottom. Temperature is on the lower axis, and the y-axis is incubation period in days. And you can see that the overall trend for both of these is incubation period decreases as temperature goes up. So just to summarize some of these findings, temperature really affects the number of mosquitoes that are emerging. It affects the pathogen in that it creates a shorter incubation time within the mosquito, meaning it's more likely to survive to transmit that pathogen. It allows the mosquito to travel further and bite more. And finally, it means that the mosquitoes are surviving longer. So it's not hard to see how this all would fit together into worsening scenarios of mosquito-borne disease. Now, there have been multiple studies looking at what that might look like. And again, these are all theoretical models because we're not quite there yet. Here you see the life cycle completions for Aedes albopictus. And you can see this is under two climate change scenarios. The solid line is the lower emission. The dotted line is the higher emission. And this divides it out by 5 different areas of the world. And you can see by and large in the temperate and the equatorial areas, the number of life cycles are increasing. And you do see that in a higher emission scenario, they do increase substantially more than the lower emission scenario. Additionally, a lot of work has been done on geographic range. And as temperatures change and precipitation changes, you're going to have an increased area where these mosquitoes can exist. Now, it's important to remember that just because the mosquito is there doesn't necessarily mean the disease is there. So the disease also has to be introduced, but with the amount of travel, that's not a hard scenario to imagine. So here you have Aedes albopictus and the US Northeast, and the red is where it currently exists. And you can see these ranges extending out over time in this model, which is a high emission CO2 model. Now, I also want to make the point that mosquitoes aren't the only vectors we're worried about. This, as many of you know, is a tick, and Lyme disease and climate variables are sort of increasingly a concern, especially in the US Northeast. And there's a lot of different things that go into tick and Lyme disease spread and survival, but just a couple of them. One is winter temperatures. The colder temperatures equal reduced host seeking of adult ticks and a reduced population of white-footed mice. So if you have warmer temperatures, you're going to have increased seeking behavior, as well as increased populations of the reservoir. Spring precipitation can lead to increased moist leaf litter, which promotes tick survival. And finally, cumulative average temperature, with higher temperatures associated with shorter tick developmental periods and lower tick mortality. So multiple things that climate variables that go into the spread of Lyme disease. And here's a model showing what we might be seeing under a high upper climate change scenario. And you can see these areas in red are areas where we're predicting to see more Lyme disease due to those climatic changes. Now, moving on to our schematic, I wanted to briefly touch on changes in the pathogen themselves. And really, there's so many examples here, it's hard to pick just one. We have waterborne pathogens like cholera, cryptosporidium, all of which things like water temperature, precipitation, flooding, salinity, El Nino events can affect and change their survival, their replication, and their transport. Airborne diseases, including hantavirus and cocci, those can be exquisitely changed by humidity and temperature. And then those things that spread through the air can be changed by wind, wildfire, and drought. And finally, foodborne pathogens, including Salmonella and Campylobacter, which can be temperature and precipitation sensitive. Now, this is a very brief list and just lists some classic examples. Most likely, if you picked a pathogen, we probably could come up with some connection to the environment and how it might change with climatic stress. Just to go into one example that I put in the airborne, that of valley fever or coccidiomycosis, or cocci for short. This is something that has been going up in the Western United States, including California. And the thing, and I don't want to go into the life cycle because it can get quite complicated, but the thing I really wanted to stress here is that it has a portion of its life cycle, which I've highlighted in yellow here, where it's in the soil. And so you can get these sort of boom cycles as you get heavy rains. And then if you get a period of drought following those rains, things dry out. And if you have heavy winds and potentially wildfires, you're aerosolizing that soil, which leads to human infection. Unfortunately, that sort of dynamic probably will spread throughout the US as the climate changes. So here's a study, again, that takes two different climate scenarios, the lesser emission in the green, the higher emission in the tan. And you can see here that the area affected, the number of endemic states, and the number of endemic counties are increasing over time for both scenarios, but are increasing faster for the higher emissions scenario. Another thing that I think we need to think about, and this is something that's very difficult to study, is antibiotic resistance in climate. And theoretically, if you have increased temperature, that'll lead to increased bacterial growth, as well as the temperature will modulate the transfer of genomic material between bacterial species. And that theoretically could lead to an increase in antimicrobial resistance. We do already have sort of the beginnings of studies on this that do suggest that as temperature decreases, you do have a higher level of resistance. This is a study looking throughout the US and looking at temperatures and then the amount of resistance reported at each temperature. They stratify by year, but what you can see as you increase temperature, regardless of the year, the resistance is going up. And the authors here do find that as they increase stepwise the temperature, you do see increases in antibiotic resistance for E. coli, Klebsiella, and Staph aureus. And those are obviously some of the bad actors that we see in the hospital that can be so hard to treat. Finally, I wanted to just touch on what is really an important and understudied area as well, and that is the change in human populations, human behavior, and exposures. From the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, I think we're all now have heard about R0, when we know that really represents the success of a pathogen in a population. And what we need to understand here is that part of the formulas or the factors that are going into R0 are all about human behavior. And as we have climate events, human behavior is going to change in such a way that might, if it will, probably affect the ability of a pathogen to sustain transmission in populations. What might those changes could be? Well, here's a CNN article reporting on that the climate crisis could displace 1.2 billion people by 2050. That's a lot of people. And as we see responses to extreme weather and disarray that might cause, it's not hard to imagine a situation where we have huge shifts in human density, changes in human contact rates, where people are coming in contact with each other more frequently or in different in situations that are less hygienic. In addition, failure of infrastructure and failure of health systems, as well as novel exposures, for example, to floodwaters in areas that were not otherwise under floodwaters. And all of those things could result in scenarios where the pathogens will be able to sustain transmission in new areas and populations. So to close, I wanted to leave you again with this schematic showing that climate change and environmental change will affect all four of these, and we should expect perhaps even dramatic changes in infectious disease dynamics and burdens in some areas, and leave you just with a thought that changes in climate will cause changes in pathogens and their vectors and reservoirs, and these changes will dramatically change disease geographies and boundaries. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Openshaw. I'd like to introduce you to our next speaker, and also to say we will have her speak the full time that she's been allotted, and we will still have time for some questions. So I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Stephanie Olinger, who's just recently completed a postdoctoral studies at Stanford. She currently is the technical director for the Arctic Ice Project, which she'll tell you about. And her topic is addressing how melting of the Arctic ice is contributing to further climate change and increasing temperatures. So Dr. Olinger.
Great. Thank you very much for the lovely introduction, Julie, and thanks to the other speakers for some really informative talks. I'll provide you today with a high-level overview of the role of melting Arctic ice on climate change and how that interacts broadly with some of the other topics that have been considered today. And then I'll tell you a little bit about what we do at Arctic Ice Project and how that relates to melting ice in the Arctic. I think this might be a little bit shorter than some of the other presentations, so hopefully we'll still have plenty of time at the end for questions. So once again, I'm Dr. Stephanie Olinger. I completed a postdoc recently in the Department of Geophysics at Stanford, focused on the fracture physics of floating ice. And now I've turned my attention to the melting of sea ice in the Arctic. So we talk a lot about climate change and sea level rise, and I think that it's evident to most people that ice is an important part of that process, but what does that actually look like, and what is the role of Arctic ice in the climate system? There's two primary types of ice that exist in the Arctic. First, there's grounded ice, and you'll have to forgive, there's a little bit of lag when I turn the slide, so if things don't quite line up. And so grounded ice is everything white that you're seeing here. That's all ice that sits on top of existing land. For instance, the Greenland ice sheet, which you can see here covering Greenland, or many of the large glaciers in Alaska or Svalbard or the Canadian North. Grounded ice is very significant in the climate system because it's what is the source of sea level rise, essentially. Because that ice is not currently in the ocean system, when there's melting on the Greenland ice sheet, for instance, or calving of icebergs that enter the ocean, or flow of glaciers directly into the ocean, that contributes water into the total mass and volume of water in the ocean, which causes sea level rise to change in a spatially variable way across the planet. And so the Greenland ice sheet currently makes the largest contribution to sea level rise of anywhere in the world. You can see here the relative contributions in millimeter per year from the 90s until about 2020 from Greenland and Antarctica, and then there's some. And so why does Greenland make a larger contribution to sea level rise than Antarctica? Well, as many of you know, Antarctica, of course, is right at the South Pole or centered on it, whereas the Greenland is at a lower latitude. And so during the summer, there's significantly warmer temperatures that affect Greenland than Antarctica and cause seasonal melt of ice and acceleration of glaciers that then contribute to sea level rise. But it turns out that the Arctic is actually warming quite a lot faster than the Antarctic. And we'll circle back a little bit later to understand one of the reasons why that is. But that also contributes to elevated temperatures that cause more melting in Greenland and a larger contribution to sea level rise. And that's really evident when you look at imagery of some of the large glaciers in Greenland. Here is Jakobshavn, which of all of the glaciers in the world is the glacier that makes the single largest contribution to sea level rise. And so what we're seeing here is the terminus position, or where the glacier meets the ocean, essentially, through time. And there's a date associated with each terminus position that's shown here. And so what we can see is that starting in around 1850, the glacier was already in a mode of retreat or losing mass. And it retreated about 20 kilometers over 150 years. But just from around 2000, which is the brown line there, to 2014, it retreated just about the same amount in only 13 years. And it's continued to retreat since then and make a large contribution to sea level rise. So the other important type of ice in the Arctic climate system is, let's see if it pops up here, sea ice, which is all the white stuff that just showed up here. And so sea ice is floating ice. It's a thin, ranging from centimeters to a few meters coating of ice, if you will, that sits on top of the Arctic. And you might say, why is sea ice important? It's already floating, right? We know if you put an ice cube into a cup of water, and then that ice cube melts, the water level doesn't actually change, right? Because the mass of the ice cube is already compensated for by displacement of the water it's floating in. So if sea ice doesn't contribute to sea level rise, what does it do? Well, it turns out it plays a really important role in the climate system that in the end does contribute to sea level rise. So the most important thing that sea ice does is it essentially regulates the warming in the Arctic by reflecting incoming solar radiation. So if we go back to that last image, what you can see is that actually quite a large portion of the total surface area of the Arctic is covered by sea ice that modulates seasonally. In the summer, there's the lowest amount, and then in the winter, there's the largest. And as you can see visually here, it's much brighter. It's closer to white, which reflects pretty much all incoming light than all of the surrounding ocean. So it's like a big mirror on the North Pole, essentially. And so if we melt sea ice, here we're just looking at the surface reflectance of sea ice compared to ocean water, which for sea ice can range from around 30 to 90%, and then for uncovered ocean water is about 10%, meaning it absorbs essentially all incoming solar radiation. So if we melt sea ice, what we've done is exposed more ocean surface area to the solar radiation, which allows it to absorb more incoming solar radiation. And so if we think about that in a little bit more detail, it turns out that this forms a feedback loop that's referred to as the sea ice albedo feedback. Albedo here is a term that we use in earth sciences to refer to the total reflectance of some surface. So it's essentially an ice reflectance feedback. So here we have some sea ice. It's reflecting pretty effectively some incoming solar radiation. So let's see what happens if we melt a little bit of the sea ice. So we can see that chunk there disappeared. What we've now done is decreased the overall average reflectivity of the surface that's shown here. And we've exposed more ocean surface area to radiation absorption. And so what that does is causes warming of the ocean and then warming of the atmosphere as heat conducts from the ocean surface into the atmosphere. And so if we've warmed the atmosphere in the ocean just a little bit, that's going to cause further sea ice melting. And so since more sea ice has melted, we've once again exposed more ocean surface to solar radiation absorption. And it's clear here that that forms a positive feedback loop. That is, once you start melting sea ice, it's really, really easy to keep melting sea ice. So what has sea ice actually been doing over the past 25 years, for instance? And how does that feedback actually manifest? Here's some data shown from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Institute. Let's see if this YouTube video plays properly. Great. So what we'll see here is sea ice from about 1990 until 2015. Here, the color scale corresponds to the age of the sea ice, where white sea ice is the oldest and thickest, and blue is the thinnest. And so what you'll see is through time, the total area of sea ice shrinks, but also the proportion of older multi-year sea ice, which is white here, decreases. So what that means is that the sea ice is getting thinner, and it's dominated largely by sea ice that freezes each year during the winter rather than sea ice that exists year-round. You can also see the seasonal trend here in sea ice as we see that expansion and contraction that happens each year in the total sea ice extent. And so as we near the present, what you'll see is that, again, the total portion of multi-year sea ice is far, far lower than it used to be, indicating an overall trend of sea ice loss. So summarizing what we just learned about sea ice and its role in the albedo feedback and the sea ice loss trend that we saw over the past 25 years or so, we can summarize a bit by saying that Arctic amplification, which is a term that encompasses the sea ice albedo feedback and several others, is causing the Arctic to warm nearly 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. And so now we see that even though sea ice itself, because it's already floating, doesn't make a direct contribution to sea level rise, actually the loss of sea ice encourages further warming in the Arctic in a way that accelerates ice melt from the Greenland ice sheet and therefore accelerates the associated sea level rise. And it turns out that sea level rise is really spatially non-uniform. So if you melt ice on the Greenland ice sheet, it actually causes sea level to go up quite far from the Greenland ice sheet, not near it. And so the effects of ice melt on the Greenland ice sheet are very global and actually felt quite strongly in equatorial regions rather than in the Arctic itself. And the acceleration of warming that occurs due to Arctic amplification, of course, causes habitat loss for many important species in the Arctic, charismatic species like polar bears, but also algae, for instance, which live on the base of sea ice and contribute a really important fundamental role in the marine food chain. Sea ice loss also contributes to enhanced extreme weather events at mid-latitudes. As you melt sea ice, more cold, fresh water enters the upper areas of the ocean, as well as more solar radiation being absorbed, which radically changes the temperature distribution of the water in the Arctic, which has profound implications on some of the large-scale ocean circulation patterns that rely on global scale density gradients. And so when we interrupt those, that has profound implications on how heat is transported by ocean water across the entire planet and can cause extreme weather events at mid-latitudes and increase, for instance, the risk of wildfires in places like California. When we cause accelerated warming in the Arctic, we also encourage methane emission. It turns out that methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas, is trapped in frozen permafrost in much of the Arctic. And so as we increase warming in the Arctic, what we do is thaw permafrost, which emits methane gas, which is a potent greenhouse gas, as I said, and further encourages warming. So there's another feedback loop there, and the two of them interact with each other. And pretty much all of the public health impacts that were covered today are all related to the changes that are happening to Earth's atmosphere and temperatures, and are therefore exacerbated by sea ice loss in the Arctic. And we're on track for what's called an ice-free summer by 2050. So every year, new sea ice does freeze in the winter, but then as summer comes, it melts away. and you're left with a much smaller portion of summer sea ice. And so the ice-free summer, of course, is when you enter a regime where there's no multi-year sea ice, and all the sea ice that freezes in the Arctic freezes seasonally. And that's sort of what the conclusion of sea ice as an important role or modulator of Earth's climate. It's what's considered a tipping point, in that if we make it past that point, it might be very hard to shift back into a regime where we have multi-year sea ice. And it's regarded as one of the really important thresholds that, if avoided, could allow us to meet some of the less dire predictions of warming rather than the most dire ones. And so what can we do about this, right? Let's see if our slides go. Several ways that humanity can attempt to address the climate crisis, and in particular sea ice loss. And I'm trying to advance here, Anthony. And I'm not quite seeming able to. Okay, there we go. Thank you. First, of course, we can reduce emissions and eliminate reliance on fossil fuels. This is really the only permanent solution to the climate crisis, and in the long term, what humanity needs to do in order to adapt. So here's a nice figure that shows many of the ways we can do that. In a lot of ways, that looks like changing our primary energy source from carbon-based sources to renewable sources like solar, hydro, and wind. We can also remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. There's a lot of development going into this currently, and a lot of ways that have been proposed, some of which involve increasing the absorption of carbon dioxide into the ocean, and increasing the absorption by weathering processes in rocks, as well as reforestation, and ways that one could directly capture carbon into the soil or the crust directly from fossil fuel plants. And then the final approach that people are considering is ways that we can actually intervene in climate warming processes. And so shown here are a few of the proposed methods for Arctic sea ice specifically. These include solar radiation modification, which usually refers to atmospheric methods like stratospheric aerosol injection and marine cloud brightening, which essentially seek to increase the reflectivity of either the upper or lower atmosphere and prevent quite as much solar radiation from entering the Earth system. There's also methods that have been called ice management, which in general refers to proposed ways of pumping seawater on top of sea ice to allow it to thicken more during the winter. And then there's also surface albedo modification, which is a class of methods that seek to increase the albedo or surface reflectivity either of the ocean or of sea ice itself. This graphic also includes Arctic protection and pollution management, though those are a little bit different in terms of how they function as interventions. And so Arctic Ice Project, the organization that I direct, is a nonprofit research organization in California that focuses on sea ice albedo modification. And so our work centers around the hypothesis that if we increase the albedo or reflectivity of sea ice using reflective materials, we might be able to reduce Arctic warming and allow more multi-year sea ice to form and persist, trying to take advantage of that feedback loop, but in the other direction, right? If we can grow a little bit of sea ice, it helps mitigate warming and causes cooling in the Arctic, and that encourages further sea ice growth. So it's an attempt to push the extent of sea ice in the Arctic back into more historically normal conditions. And here's a preliminary study from some field work that was done a couple years ago in a pond in Minnesota. And what you'll see is basically what happens to this pond through the melt season from March 9th to March 20th. Here, a type of material that's essentially silica microspheres was used on the left half of the pond. You can see these rectangular regions where there was about a 0.5 millimeter layer that was applied. And you can see visibly that it's a whiter surface. And then that reduced the sea ice melt rate by thickness by about 36% and reduced the melt rate by extent by around 70%. So we're optimistic that either silica microspheres or other naturally derived materials like calcium carbonate might have the potential to significantly reduce the melt rate of sea ice in the Arctic and allow for more persistent multi-year sea ice and significantly cooler temperatures in the long term in the Arctic. I don't have a figure of it in this slide, but we also have some climate modeling work that should be published quite soon that shows that annual applications of reflective material to about 10% of the Arctic area for around 35 years could cause approximately 3 degrees of cooling in reference to a control simulation, so cooler than business as usual by around 3 degrees. And I think that's where I'll call it for today. In summary, the Arctic is undergoing critical changes that exacerbate the symptoms of climate change globally and the public health impacts across the planet. And only with concerted effort can humanity act in time to prevent the Arctic from passing key tipping points in terms of sea ice loss and methane emission, for instance. But the optimistic side is that there is research being done into a whole host of ways that this could happen, which will hopefully, if proven to be safe and effective, be implemented in concert with concerted efforts to decarbonize and reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. So thank you very much. I know we're a little over time, so I'll turn it back to Julie for questions now. And feel free to scan this QR code to see our website. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Dr. Olinger. I'm going to invite Nancy Clum to the screen to go over some of the good questions that we have received. And we don't plan to extend this much beyond 5 minutes or so. So thank you for staying with us. Nancy?
Sure. First of all, several people said excellent, important work. Thank you for great presentations. But I'll start with Dr. Darrow, playing devil's advocate, since I do believe in human effect on climate. How did that study possibly separate out anthropogenic versus climate change from non-anthropogenic? And you can pronounce that better than I can.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's clearly very complicated. So this was not my study, actually. This was what I thought was a very well done and prominent study that came out in 2021. But basically, there are a series of climate models that have tried to model how much greenhouse gases have changed the climate, and essentially they go back to, and they use sort of the ensemble of all these models. So basically a lot of different foundational work that tried to estimate how much climate change has affected the climate. And essentially they create a counterfactual weather pattern. So it's a simulation, statistical simulation that sort of like imputes what the weather would have been if the underlying climate trends, that there hadn't been any greenhouse gas, human greenhouse gas contributions. So you could check out that study. They have a long explanation, but basically they're doing their best to sort of take out what they think is the heating, right, that's coming from human induced, from human released greenhouse gases. So they have some better explanation than I have, but it is all model based, right? But basically what you look at when you actually see their time series, they have a time series that shows how temperature actually went over time in all these locations, which you have increasing days, increasing number of hot days. And then they have a simulated data set where they've attempted to take out the excess hot days, is what I would say. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Dr. Willenbring, have you looked at specific soil types that do better in warming climate?
Oh, yeah, that's a really great question. So there are just a cascade of different things that happen when you change temperature. And some of them, for example, are that you increase the acidity, or you by decomposing organic matter, you can actually increase the acidity, decrease the pH, so make it more acidic. And that acidity actually causes all kinds of problems for soils being able to hold on to contaminants. So like heavy metals that are sticking to soil particles, kind of like a filter, if you change the pH too much, will actually become liberated. This is the main thing that happened with acid rain. It wasn't that the acid actually killed the plants. It was that the acid changed the soil chemistry, which allowed all kinds of metals that killed the plants to go into the root system. It's kind of like a subtle thing, but really important. And so I would say some of the soils that are better for withstanding climate change are ones where you have probably like large ranges in temperature already, so that when it experiences something different, it probably won't affect the biota as much. Unlike in the Arctic, where you might experience like kind of a smaller range of temperatures, or potentially in the tropics, where everything is kind of like always pretty warm, and so it's not a big deal. So I would say that maybe that is a way to think about the problem, but it's actually really a challenging thing to answer because of all of the little parts that we don't understand totally that are going to surprise us when we change one part of the Earth system.
Thanks. Dr. Openshaw. So this is a question about heat causing lower developmental time. Does that mean they become premature or they need shorter time to mature?
Yeah, sorry, I answered that in the text. It means that
Oh, okay.
the amount of time required for that organism to mature is shorter.
Okay, and the next, let me get the next. There was a second question for you. When considering temperature impact on vectors, reservoirs, what temperature would be most relevant? Mean temperature, max daytime temperature, or minimum nighttime temperature?
Yeah, it's a good question, and the answer is all of the above, unfortunately, that with these very complex environmental systems, it's really hard to find the one thing that's very important. And all of those things can be important. Cumulative temperature can be important. Obviously, if you have a cold snap or a warm snap, that's really quite above and beyond what you normally have, that could lead to dramatic changes. And so there's not one that I could pick. I think that for each reservoir, you might also find different outcomes. And so when this is something that's very complicated, you have to go system by system. But in general, what I will say is most of the good models looking at this are using a combination of all of these.
Dr. Willenbring, please comment on how you might estimate the nature capital of soil, nature capital, an ancient and incredibly rare resource on which we all depend. I think there's an informed participant here.
That is such a great question. It's really, I think, a failure of economics in order like that they don't have it right, like how to think about this problem. So for example, if you talk to a climate scientist, you'll hear that climate change poses a really dire threat to humanity. But the reason that they say that is because like all these different things will change, people will lose the places that they live, maybe farming will be impossible in places in the world where people depend on it right there. But if you ask a neoclassical economist about fighting climate change, I think you'd get a really different answer, because they'd say like, oh, don't worry, it's not much of a problem because, agriculture is a tiny percentage of GDP. And so if we destroy our ability to farm, our economic output will remain virtually unchanged. So these are how economic models currently work. And you can see how that's fundamentally flawed, because it used to be that there were three kind of factors of production in economic theory. One was labor, one was capital, we still have those, but we got rid of land. Like for no reason, no physical reason did we get rid of land. In some cases, we got better at like farming the land, but ultimately we still need land in order to do all of the other things that we do, including live. And so I could go on and on, as you can imagine. I'll leave it there.
Okay, let's see. So what would be the unintended consequences with adding chemical entities to sea ice? So that's for you, Dr.
Yeah.
Olinger.
That's a great question, and if it's okay, I'll tie that into the other question that was asked by Sylvia, which I think is related. Certainly, right, adding any reactive substance into the ocean could have far-reaching chemical effects. For that reason, we're pretty much focused on materials that we don't expect to be highly reactive with the ocean or are already found in abundance in the ocean. For instance, silica, glass, essentially, right, is the same as quartz, essentially, with a slightly different crystalline structure. And so it makes up the bulk of sediment, or a large part of the sediment that forms Earth's beaches and seafloors. And calcium carbonate, one of the other materials that we're thinking about, is largely found from the deposition of the small exoskeletons of zooplankton and such, and forms lots and lots of seafloor deposits. It's also being considered as a remedy for ocean acidification, in which it would also be introduced in large quantity to the ocean. So the hope is that there wouldn't be chemical effects. However, there, of course, could be ecotoxicological effects in terms of there being particulate matter that could be consumed by important zooplankton, for instance. So we've got some ecotoxicological studies going with Norwegian partners in labs to determine whether or not these types of particles get eaten by important zooplankton and how that relates to the properties and size of the particles that are used. That research is still being conducted, so I can't report on the results yet, but we won't progress to a large-scale field test or even small-scale field test that's in an uncontrolled setting unless we think that there's a really strong consensus of there being minimal impact. And so to answer Sylvia's question, what do we started to work in the Arctic, Greenland, or Canada yet? And if not, what do we need? Well, we have not yet, because we're still doing some of this research that I think is really, really critical to determining whether or not this is a safe thing to do. And even for small scale studies, it's really, really important that Indigenous communities local to those areas and communities of all types are engaged with and approving of any types of experimentation. That process takes quite a long time. So in some ways, what we need is funding. It turns out that climate intervention research is in general somewhat controversial, and so there's not a great funding landscape for it. And so the amount of research that we can do is in some ways bandwidth limited by funding. So hopefully we'll have some luck with that in the future, and we'll be able to get all of the preliminary research done that will allow us to progress towards more field testing. And the next step that we have in mind is one of several facilities that exist in the northern US and then 2 in Canada that are essentially concrete pools that allow you to pump in real seawater and cause sea ice to freeze in what is essentially a controlled experimental facility where you can do experiments on real sea ice, but with no chance of environmental contamination. And so that's what we see as a next step. And if those results are promising and we have what feels like convincing evidence from ecotoxicological work, then we'll consider progressing towards uncontrolled field studies in the real world. But there's a lot to do before then. Thanks.
Julie, how are we on time? I have at least one more question. Some thanks for the answers, but how are we on time?
Well, we're over, but go ahead and ask the question. If people choose to leave, they can.
So this is for Dr. Openshaw. As a recent victim of dengue fever and resident of San Diego, Janice has had 2 locally acquired cases. I would be interested in the specifics regarding the increasing cases of dengue in Mexico and travel northward into the US.
Yeah, it's a good question. Dengue globally overall is on the rise. It's increased more than tenfold in the last 10 years. So there's a tremendous amount of dengue out there. We have seen local transmission of dengue in the US. We have the mosquito vectors that's vectored by Aedes mosquitoes. We have those in California. We have those widespread throughout the United States. So there is a risk that it could be introduced. And, you know, mosquitoes, just as humans travel around, you can have infected people traveling. You can also have infected mosquitoes traveling. You know, they can hitch rides on in many, many different ways. And you know, I think it's really only a matter of time, and you know, when we're going to see these Aedes vector diseases coming up in warmer areas in the United States. I think that's just the reality of it. You know, dengue is one of those diseases that can sustain itself from a human, you know, infected humans causing more infected humans, but there's also a sylvatic cycle or a wild cycle that happens in the forest amongst animal reservoirs. We don't have that established here in the US, and it probably would take a bit to get that established. But, you know, I think that with the reservoir, with the vector present, you know, there are chances that we will have more locally acquired dengue cases. And I think it's really a matter of when. How many we will have, I think, is an open question. But you know, it will happen.
Okay, Julie, to you.
Okay, well, our time is more than up. I just want to thank everybody for participating, to our speakers, also to those of you that hung in there for the last 15 minutes. We really appreciate our audience as well. So have a good evening, everybody. On behalf of the alumni groups that brought you this, good night, I guess. Thank you.